All right. Hey, folks. So today we're going to discuss a new meta-analysis on hypertrophy muscle growth. Now, as you guys know, and I know what you're thinking, Faz, you're not a very big fan of science studies anymore. I get it. I'm not. And I'm also not a very big fan of like science reporting YouTube people, but bear with me. This is a summary recommendation. It's a meta-analysis of the last sort of 5 to 10 years of work. And it's the collaboration of a lot of scientists, many of whom are on different ends of the spectrum when it comes to hypertrophy recommendations like high volume, low volume, train to failure, don't train to failure. So when something like this comes out, I do sit up and take notice, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to run through it, but I also want to run through it via my own experiences as a coach and give you my own spin on things, because I know you guys like that kind of thing. So let's get into it. But firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below, particularly about this one. Let me know what you think. How does this match up to your experiences? That's what I want to know. And also, if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. Sign up for coaching. Let's get some results together. Work with me one-on-one. I do check-ins. I have my own software that I use to track your progress, to ensure that you're making progress. I have my system of block training, so we do evaluations and check-ins and all that. And I'm well versed in getting results now. So if you're stuck, if you're in a rut, just try it. Let's go. 3-month commitment. It's not much, and let's go. Let's get some results. Right. Let's get on with the video. So the paper was called "Resistance Training Recommendations to Maximize Muscle Hypertrophy in an Athletic Population." So this is very specific to all the guys and girls who watch my channel. We are talking about maximum muscle hypertrophy in a population that trains. So we're not talking about untrained people. We're not talking about hypertrophy for sports. This is us. Like, let's get gains, and we are well trained. I will link the paper so you guys can download it and read it in full for yourself, because it's free for access. Now, one of the things that I quite liked about this paper was, look at who's involved in the paper. Some pretty big names. Now, we have Mr. Volume himself, Brad Schoenfeld. Yeah. We have the other end of the spectrum, which is James Fisher and James Steele. Those are if you guys might remember I've mentioned them before, the British researchers who are very much low volume train to failure guys. In the ironic Dorian Yates style, they are low volume train to failure advocates, whereas Brad is more of a very high volume, guy. And we also have the more sort of midline, Eric Helms, Cody Horn type of guys. So it's a good blend of, popular researchers. Now, it is a massive paper at 30 pages. So it's a lot. There's a lot here. So I want to go to the end where they provide a table of the summary of the entire paper. So there's quite, I would recommend reading this anyway if you are interested in hypertrophy, because there's a lot of detail here about various topics, relationship between hypertrophy and strength. Look here, and like reconciling acute versus longitudinal data. So they touch on how they're actually measuring the growth, which is something that I've discussed before as well. How can you measure growth in the short term, in the long term? Does it match up? So there's a lot to be said here. It's a very complete paper. One of my criticisms was about short-term growth not really being a good representation of what long-term growth is. So yeah, do 45 sets for 3 months until you break, right? But that doesn't help you for the rest of the year when you're sitting around injured. So they cover that, and the recommendations are in light of that. And this is why I like these kind of papers. I'm not a massive fan of single studies, and I don't like to derive too much from single studies, but big papers like this are quite useful. So anyway, I'd recommend reading it, but we are going to focus mostly on the end table because there's a lot of stuff here. Here we go. So this is a summary of consensus recommendations. So that is the consensus of all the guys who worked on this paper. Now, we start off by looking at load. Now, load basically means, for all intents and purposes, it kind of means percentage of your 1 rep max. Okay, so how heavy are you going? Now, this says individuals can achieve comparable muscle hypertrophy across a wide spectrum of loading zones. What that means in English is, if you lift heavy or you lift light, you can still get gains. There may be practical benefit to prioritizing the use of moderate loads for the majority of sets in a hypertrophy-oriented training program. So what that's saying is the majority of your work should probably be in the 8 to 12 rep range, which is what most people would consider fairly moderate, or even like 5 to 15, I guess. 5 is on the low to moderate side, but still. Preliminary evidence suggests a potential hypertrophic benefit to employing a combination of loading ranges. This can be accomplished through a variety of approaches. So what this is saying is it's probably wise to employ a wide range of repetitions. So like, for example, I released an ebook recently, which focused on heavy, light, medium system. So across the week, the way that I accomplish the varying sets and reps and loading intensities in that ebook was that I have different days associated with heavy lifting, with light lifting, and with moderate lifting. Other ways of doing it is if you have a bro split and you just do a wide range of sets and reps. So like you might go heavy on the compounds, you might go lighter, higher reps on the isolation work. That's another way of doing things. And I think people are quite familiar with that approach. But the idea is that you should try not to do, 3 sets of 10 for every single thing in your program. So, that's a fairly sensible recommendation so far. It's not like we don't, and we're probably going to get a few of the whole, we don't need a study to tell us this. Like, again, guys, we know how bodybuilding works. We're not looking for studies to tell us how to train. These are just interesting tidbits which support what we already know works and maybe solidifies some of the questions that we have asked in the past. So the next one is the big one, which is volume. And as you guys know, like that is one which has really caused a lot of almost like fights to occur in the evidence-based community. So volume. A dose of approximately 10 sets per muscle group per week seems to be a general minimum prescription. I like this, okay, because for the past 5 or 10 years, all you've heard about is 10 to 20 sets, 10 to 20 sets. With everyone thinks they need to go right up to the top of 20, but we're saying here, let's keep our feet firmly on the ground. About 10 sets seems to be a decent compromise. Evidence indicates potential hypertrophic benefits to higher volumes, particularly of relevance to underdeveloped muscle groups. So you can go a little bit higher volume for areas which are lagging. And again, my routine, the Berserker, which is also in the description, that is a specialization routine. It chronicles that year and a half roughly where I specialized on delts and biceps. And yes, I did it by working those areas 4 times a week. So there you go. I'm ahead of the curve. Although empirical evidence is lacking, there may be benefit to periodizing volume to increase systematically over a training cycle. That point, I think, is I don't really think it deserves to be there. There is no evidence to support that, really, apart from a very minimal study by Israel and Feather, which is just like one of its kind. I think increase systematically over a training lifestyle, sure, but over a training cycle, I don't think so. It may be prudent to limit incremental increases in the number of sets for a given muscle group to 20% of an athlete's previous volume during a training cycle, then readjust accordingly. So what that's saying is if you're doing, say, 10 sets, okay, 20% of that is 2 sets. This is saying that you may want to increase by a couple of sets across 4 weeks. So we're not going from 10 to 20 sets in a mesocycle. That's way too much, And as I said to you guys, I've moved away from doing that type of thing with my clients. I don't do that with myself or my clients anymore. I mostly have static volumes. I think I've just not seen it to work particularly well. It seems to be fairly injurious, so I don't think it's a great idea. Now, next thing is frequency. Significant hypertrophy can be achieved when training a muscle group as infrequently as once per week, and there doesn't even seem to be much of a benefit to greater weekly per muscle training frequencies. What this does say, though, is that if you are going to do more than 10 sets, you may want to just like do a body part multiple times, which makes sense. If you have, 30 sets per muscle group per week to do for whatever reason, not that you should be doing that, but if you're going to do that, then your quality of sets is going to drop off by the time you get to the last couple of exercises. So it's probably worth your while to split that up. Again, fairly sensible. Now, rest intervals and exercise selection. They're quite happy to say 2 minutes when performing multi-joint exercises or shorter rest periods for single joint. So I covered this in a video recently where I was discussing that the consensus for the rest periods so far, it seems to be getting shorter and shorter, and it seems to be resembling more and more what the golden era guys were doing, which is about a minute rest. So up until 2 years ago or even a year ago, people were just convinced 3 minutes was the way to go, because you could do more work, which is always the argument given. It's like, I don't want to half-ass my sets. Well, my counter argument to that is, well, if you can get more work done or you can improve your cardiovascular system, then you can do more. with more quality work. So I don't really think that's, or the other argument is, well, why don't you just rest 5 minutes or rest 10 minutes or rest 20 minutes between sets? Then you'll have full recovery. So that argument doesn't really wash, like, oh, I want to wait longer to do quality sets. Yeah, that doesn't, if you think about it, that argument doesn't really match reality. I still think research in the rest interval area is lacking. So I think that recommendation is very new, and we're probably going to see that changed for all of this, really. Exercise selection, they talk about a variety of work. Free weight exercises should be performed, and less complex exercises should be rotated in. It's all very good. And if we look at the set endpoint, this is basically talking about whether you should train to failure or not. Novice lifters can achieve gains in muscle mass without training at a close proximity to failure. Highly trained athletes may benefit from taking some sets to muscular failure. Oh dear. Right. So, and that's basically the end of the recommendations. So can I just summarize like the two biggest points of this? So volume should be more on the lower end, like close to the 10 sets. And we should probably be trained to failure if we're trained individuals. So the whole 45 sets, high volume, not trained to failure, trained to failure will kill your gains, all that BS. And a lot of these YouTube guys would just base whole videos on misreporting the science, leaning on the science, leaning on one study. It's all a load of BS. Like, this kind of stuff I do take somewhat seriously because it's a large collection of researchers looking at a large body of data, pretty much the entire last 10 years of data. Single studies which get overblown by the likes of your, fuck it, I'll just go ahead and say it, by the likes of your Jeff Nippard and your whoever else, like, they don't mean a great deal. So I like stuff like this a lot better, or I just prefer to speak from experience because I think there are things that science hasn't really tested yet. And I'm not anti-science. As I say, we've got to view it within the lens of what it's currently achieved. It's kind of like a baby at this stage, particularly the last 10 years. Prior to that, we didn't have a great deal. After roughly the wormborn meta-analysis, that's where it really started to kick off. But it's kind of like a baby at this stage. It's going to make some mistakes. It's going to learn. It's still learning. It's still perfecting its personality. It's still perfecting its traits. Yeah, let's just really focus on progress. But that summary of what we know over the last 10 years does seem to suggest that the kind of stuff that I say on my channel, limited number of sets, heavier weights, training to failure, is all stuff which works, and it works tremendously well. I still feel there is room for further nuance. Like, I still feel that some people benefit from shorter rest periods, and we could probably, I suspect it's something to do with body types and body type in the sense of like heavy or light bone structures. I think there's something in that, and how much stress your ligaments can actually handle to really nuke your muscles to the point of training of failure within a session. I think there's something in that. But anyway, I will leave it there. Hopefully you found that somewhat interesting. That was really just a report on this meta-analysis. I'll link it in the description. But for a more practical view on things, I have a bunch of other videos which look at practical stuff. And every now and again, I do like to do these study videos. Hopefully you found it interesting. Right, I'll call it there anyway.